Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first edition of our Second Sight Conversations, highlighting nominees for the 2023 Medium Photo Second Sight Award. Nominations for the award were made by participating reviewers in the 2022 Medium Review, which took place in San Diego on May 5th and 6th. I'm Scott Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Medium Photo and happy to have you all here today. Today, we're featuring the work of two artists, Chanell Stone and Vikesh Kapoor. Both Chanell and Vikesh participated in the 2022 Medium Review, with Chanell having the honor of receiving one of our Black Artist Scholarships organized by Medium Photo. Today, each artist will present a presentation about their work, followed by conversation and questions with Shana Lopes, the Assistant Curator of Photography at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. I encourage those who are joining us live today to share questions you have for each of the presenters by using the chat feature. We'll share relevant works or relevant links, about each artist's work in the chat during today's program and circle back with questions that are posed by our live audience. We are recording today's presentation and we'll archive this online at mediumphoto.org. And I want to mention that we are broadcasting from the unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Diego and Tijuana region. The Kumeyaay continue to call this land home and share their culture, stories, and art for the greater good. I'd like to express thanks to the Kumeyaay Nation for sharing this land with all of us. We'll begin today with the work of Chanell Stone. Chanell currently lives and works in Southern California and uses self-portraiture, collage, and poetry to investigate the Black body's intersectional states of being and their connection to the natural world. Chanell holds a BFA from the California College of the Arts and is currently an MFA candidate at the University of California, San Diego. Her work has been exhibited throughout the United States and internationally, and is currently on view in the exhibition Sightlines at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and at Pier 24 in San Francisco as part of the exhibition Looking Forward. Her work has been published in the New York Times, on NPR, Aperture, Pop Magazine, and Vogue. And we'll post links relevant to Chanell's work in the chat for our live audience to reference after today's talk. Chanell's work was nominated by the following reviewers in May of 2022 for the Second Sight Award. And I'm proud to welcome Chanell Stone to begin today's presentation.
Hello, everyone. Excited to be here with you all to speak about my work, and let me get started. Okay. Can everyone see this? Okay. So my name is Chanell Stone, and as Scott introduced, I'm currently based in Southern California, working in the San Diego area, and I am originally from Los Angeles. So my work is very rooted in my upbringing here in Southern California, as well as my family origins. The impetus behind a lot of my work stems from my grandmothers on my maternal side. This is the side of my family that has held on to a lot of the family stories, archives, and photographs, and those oral histories have been passed down to me through deep inquiry. So what we're seeing right here is a collage of my grandmothers on my mother's side. So in the foreground is my great-grandma holding my grandmother as a baby. Behind them is a photograph taken of a painting in my grandmother's home that shows the transatlantic slave trade. On the left, there is an enslaved African cutting pineapples, which calls to the Caribbean experience. And on the right, there are people working in the cotton fields, which ties it to the North American continent. And just looking at this idea of lineage in a particular land, lineage in this country, and thinking about what is behind us and what is in front of us. So behind my grandmother's is this a part of our history here in this land, not exclusively, but it is a significant marker. And in the foreground with them seated in this studio portrait taken in Texas in the 1940s, I saw it as a evidence of foreshadowing where they would end up in this American landscape. It's a painted backdrop that looks semi-tropical. You see this palm tree painted in. That's not indicative of the part of Texas they were from, which was northern Texas, but it did foreshadow where they would end up migrating a few years later, which was to Southern California, LA specifically. And this idea of photographs being a type of way to show aspiration and a projection of how you want to be seen, but also where you may end up. And the way that they're dressed, you wouldn't necessarily be able to gauge that they're working class people. It's this idea of presenting your best self or just projecting, again, authorship of one's image. And I just thought about that and the evidence of like lineage and history evident in the foreground as well in the background. And what's on top of this is a vellum substrate that I use as a way to obscure sight and force the viewer to look a little closer to see behind it. To me, it also calls to the idea of memory and things fading that are just out of grasp, but not quite as far away as we might think. So this is an actual 3-layer collage. This is the digital representation of it, but it is actually a tactile physical piece. Moving into the current, this is a picture of me and my great-grandmother. It's a self-portrait. So that's the same woman that was in the picture before. She was holding my grandma. And in this one, I'm standing beside her. This was photographed in her home in South LA earlier this year. She's now back in California. She definitely had, a forced migration to move to LA to escape the Jim Crow Southern conditions, but also to pursue her own dreams elsewhere. And she went back to Texas in the 90s, actually. She really loved living in the South. And I found that fascinating, this idea of just the different histories that exist on the land and the idea of not necessarily wanting to leave, but having to leave due to social conditions. And now she's back with us in her senior years. She's in her 90s. And I thought it was meaningful to make this image with her. I've never photographed her before. This is the first time I've directly involved family so concretely in the work. And it was a fun experience being able to do that and share this with her. And the fact that she was so open to it, she definitely saw the significance of it and was a willing participant. That's something I'm looking forward to bringing into the work more, is the use of the women in my family. Again, calling to this idea of where does most of my inspiration come from? It comes from the lineage of those before me, the women specifically before me. So in this picture is my great-grandmother holding a picture of my great-great-grandmother. And in the corner of the frame is my grandma. So it's 3 generations within this photograph. And I'm very fortunate to have my great-grandma and grandmother still alive, living with me. But this idea of like asking and wanting to know, where do we come from before LA, like even before Texas, and being able to hear their stories that they still hold on to and remember. And most of it can be tracked back as far as towards the end of slavery, which I find interesting, and just the idea of who remembers what and what is passed down through oral histories and inquiry. So this led me to investigate different sites of the Great Migration that really interest me. My family went west to LA, but I also think about the duality of that being far east in New York, for instance. So this photograph was made in Brooklyn. And this was me looking at the American landscape in a different capacity. I was looking at it in terms of the urban landscape, because I saw it as, for all intents and purpose, this is now a landscape of its own. And this idea of where does the Black body sit within that? And to me, that led me to the inner city and the idea of that being the epitome of this man-made cityscape. And I saw this plant when I was walking. A big part of my process is meandering, seeing what comes to me. And it was in the middle of this courtyard. Behind it is a public housing unit for low-income individuals. And I saw beauty in this building that wasn't really designed to be beautiful. It was designed to house and store people of color. And there was still a beauty evident there in the way that the plants interacted with the space. And I saw this plant and was called to stand within it. And much to my surprise, I later found out that this plant is called the plantation lily. It has some alternative names as well. But I found that to be really metaphorical and interesting in terms of what I'm focused on in my research and in my art practice, which is lineage in the American landscape and how this plant got to New York even, or how it got to the States, and how and why it's called the plantation lily. And that kind of led me down this idea of plants also migrating with people. And those histories evident literally in these life forms. And my process is primarily fully analog. All of these are shot on medium format, and it's typically the camera, tripod, sometimes the help of a friend, and oftentimes individual. It's a very closed process. And after I started to venture out to different cities that I would travel to, like New York, or living in the Bay for several years, I decided to come back to this source, come back to the roots of where my earliest memory of my existence within this landscape started, and this love for the natural world. And that was my grandmother's garden. So this is my grandma's garden in LA. And looking at this idea of how my grandmother didn't let her confines of her small home limit her expression with her green thumb, and like really beautifying the space and reclaiming it as a sacred space. So with these plants, they operate as a kind of barrier. I saw them as a form of protection. You have these interesting metal bars covering the windows, and then you have the plants operating as a second layer. And this particular grandmother, this is my paternal grandmother's garden. She's very, very private and very selective of who comes in, who comes out. I had to practically beg her to be able to photograph back here, but I think it's evident in the way that this environment even looks, the way she structured it, and how it can also serve as a portrait of her without her necessarily being in the photograph, and just my place within it. And you see little happenstance things like her dog entering in the corner of the frame. I leave everything as is. The only thing that's posed or, you know, somewhat staged is myself, but all these environments are left just as I found them. This is another view of my grandmother's garden, reincorporating the vellum to obscure sight and create a type of opacity where you cannot necessarily access it in physical space, like in real life. This would be much more obfuscated. Here, you can kind of see through it a bit more. But this idea of holding something back, I feel like the vellum allows me to do that. I feel oftentimes with identity-based work, there's this kind of expectation to over-explain your humanity, over-explain yourself, and make it very didactic. In terms of an artist talk, I don't mind revealing these things, but I think about it away from this setting and how I want to hold something back for myself. Like, how do I keep what's sacred to me? So by just obscuring the site, it allows for that to be activated and just being in the space. And I just thought, you know, if you were in this safe garden-like space, like you could just be your natural self, like in your natural body without necessarily need to be clothed. So the nudity was used in an artistic way to kind of show like this natural self in this safe space. And with this exploration of man-made and natural world, I started looking at my body literally amongst these plants. Some of these plants are your mundane, everyday garden weed, but I saw beauty in that. I'm very drawn to beauty in what is often overlooked, what is written off as insignificant, and just reclaiming that as beautiful. And I see that as a direct parallel to what's happening in many of these cities, LA, Brooklyn, Also Oakland, which I have a few photographs in the slideshow that I made there. Cities all undergoing gentrification rapidly at the same time, and cities in which have significant Black histories that have been erased or are currently being erased. And I just think about how those spaces were once written off as well, but now it's being reclaimed. Apparently there was an inherent value there, and who gets pushed out in that reclamation process. So this is like my way of creating a sort of intervention to call focus on the beauty evident in these spaces. And then I think about the idea of a protective wall, a barrier, and how plants can also create that as well. And just this idea of what is able to be accessed and what is able to be withheld. So that's a reoccurring theme as well within the work. And also just environmental portraits moving through these spaces. This is another view of my grandmother's garden, and just seeing the way her plants just literally burst out of the seams and bring life to the space quite literally, but also the everyday things of like her drying her blanket on the clothing line and how that creates a sort of veil, something kind of blocking. And this idea of that ebb and flow between entering and then being denied at the same time. This one was photographed in Oakland, in Fruitvale, and I was really drawn to, again, these idea of these plants that grow from these very concrete, rigid environments. This tree is bursting out of another concrete sea and not being held back by its constraints, so to speak, and how it almost looks as if it could be not in the city, but then you see the evidence of, say, the trash can that brings it back to a residential context. And I like to have little clues of evidence that just kind of root it back. Also the chain link fence directly in the background. And the idea of, as these locales diversify, the fluidity of my own identity within these spaces, often changed by maybe hairstyles or clothing. Sometimes the clothing is used as a repetitive tool to kind of create a certain homogenous feel to the storytelling. But again, how I change within these spaces too. And looking closely at times, it's not always obvious that it's me, but I find that interesting, the fluidity of identity based in certain environments. Again, back to Brooklyn. You see the gate and the brick wall of the shed, the rubble in the background, rooting it back into a city. What I find interesting is how some of these plants can kind of call to where this might be. Some were able to identify that this was in New York. Some thought maybe the Midwest, but it definitely didn't read as California. Whereas others, like in my grandmother's garden with all the succulents, it definitely roots it back into a warmer climate. And I find that to be interesting, how that could give clues as to where these places might be. And again, bringing it back to the epitome of the inner city. This is a public housing unit, the projects in the Watts neighborhood of LA. These are the Imperial Courts. And I decided to photograph here because I remember seeing these structures as a child when we would go down that way. And I never understood what it was. It looked very institutional, very prison-like. I later learned through research that it was a former World War II military barrack that was converted into public housing later on. And through speaking with my grandmothers about our history, learning that my grandfather, when he migrated to California with my great-grandmother during the 50s, during the time of the Great Migration, they lived in the projects too, not necessarily these, but some that are right down the street from this. And this idea of not even realizing we had a kind of family history here, and this idea of where we started, and this pursuit of upward mobility despite all these confines and like social barriers. And with this, the use of shadows definitely is reoccurring, and the idea of what is casting impression without it necessarily being seen, like what is the evidence of things unseen within these environments. You kind of can see the tree peeking out from the top right corner. But again, these impressions of nature amidst these very man-made spaces, and in this case, a man-made space that has very troubled, multi-storied history as it relates to the Black body and people of color. And, you know, ebbing and flowing again between the coasts, looking at the plants amidst this literal idea of like a rock in a hard place. You see this apartment building, the basketball courts in the foreground. I kept thinking about what are these quintessential identifiers of an urban city, the basketball courts being a classic trope, but I wasn't drawn to the basketball court. I was drawn to the plant in the background and how it is just a common everyday plant, but how it's like bursting and growing so lusciously with all these layers in front of it, and just really being drawn to it, and the underexposure being yet again another tool to kind of like focus you in to look a bit deeper at what may be the actual center of the photograph. And again, environmental portraits of these spaces, the courtyards in between them. This is in New York and Harlem, and how that intersection appears and manifests. Sometimes slight impressions of the body without it being a deliberate portrait. At times it's not always so direct. And again, the recurring theme of the barrier protection. And then my work also branches off into things that are studies. Me looking at the body in a very different context here, indoors, in a studio like setup in the home, and thinking about obscuring sight in different ways, in this case through the use of different substrates, and calling to this idea of the body's relationship to the plants more directly in terms of form, and just the way the light hits and the mimicry happening there. So again, really looking at the body as a kind of material as well, combined with the plants. The use of diptychs is also reoccurring. This one really calling to the shape present in the body on the left, and how it is mirrored in the shape of this plant on the right. And this idea of relating the Black body to the natural world in different capacities. In this case, almost like a still life, and bringing the two together. So moving from the outdoor into the indoor as well, in a more controlled setting. And the idea of the bodyscape, the idea of the body being the one true landscape that a Black person can call to, at least in the experience of here in America, where it's so rooted in migration. I think about starting with slavery and post-slavery, and how that has been a reoccurring movement, a forced movement with my family that still continues to this day, like constantly moving, and thinking of the idea of body memory, like if the land is always changing and these histories are often hidden, it's calling to my own body memory to be able to access what I can from certain spaces, as well as the evidence of my ancestors literally on the skin. So I'm very interested in moving further into that concept, into that space. And more recently, the work has led me to go to the South. I kind of walked you through the urban landscape, me looking at where I grew up, as well as other places I've lived or traveled to that have stood out to me. And then that led me to take those oral histories from my grandmothers and actually go back to these places, which I was so fortunate to be able to do through conquering a lot of fear. This one was photographed in Mississippi, which is where my paternal grandmothers are from, and never really thinking I would go to Mississippi, but I did. And being able to make this work there in the background, you see the Mississippi River in the foreground. It's photographed from this hilltop site looking down onto the river, and just being drawn to it, rather, how it operated in this kind of duality where, for all intents and purposes, it was beautiful, but also a hellscape. If I think about the many histories here from my ancestors and how when those particular grandmothers left, they never went back, not until they were passed away and buried there back home. But this idea of how these multiple stories can exist, but also just how it impacted me, like seeing it, and how it reminded me of a kind of Africa, and this idea of me always searching for a point of origin, a point of understanding of myself, be it the land, or my actual identity. And this led me to incorporate a bit of writing. Um, Writing is a part of my practice. I've recently been sharing it. It's something I usually do privately, but this was just a reflection of my time in Mississippi that I wrote once I was back home, once I was able to process it. And just thinking about it and being able to put it into words. Sometimes photographs are just um, voiceless. Like they could be worth 1,000 words, but sometimes it could be 1,000 wrong words. So including my own to kind of bring myself directly into it again. So to call to this experience and put words to it. I'm not going to necessarily read it, but it's something I wanted to include. And moving through different parts of the South and how those locales vary and change depending on where you are in the Deep South, and myself within those spaces. Um, it's sometimes turning away from the camera, not always addressing the viewer's gaze or the camera's gaze. And this is how it existed, an exhibition. This was at McAvoy Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco, and it existed in this capacity. So the poem is the second one on the left, and it existed as a kind of series. And again, including that photograph I started with my great grandmother holding my grandma to bring them into this experience as I moved through these different spaces and had these personal reflections in this search for my own point of origin, like where do I come from? And this leads me into some of the current work that I've been working on, which is again investigating different materials, different substrates, how it could obscure sight, how it could allow certain things, and the use of creating these illusions photographically, bringing in the natural world in a different capacity. The use of shadow coming back, but the idea of, as I mentioned a little bit before, denying the camera's gaze, not always gazing back, but the power in turning away, and really calling to this idea of the body again, looking at the form of the back, looking at the form of my anatomy, the skin, the texture. And in this case, it's against a wall, whereas in other photographs, it's very expansive. You see the landscape behind me, it feels a bit more open. This is a bit more pulled back and focused in, and the shadows reoccurring again. These were photographed in Mexico earlier this year, and I was really drawn to those environments as well, and this idea of existing outside of the States, and how does myself as a Black individual interact in a different land with a very different history as it relates to my own ancestry, and just moving within those spaces in that way. Again, the use of kind of splitting the frame into twos, and light, shadow, a flattening that is occurring with these works. Again, the interplay of movement and the body, and pulling and parsing through it for something more that is within the skin, within the flesh. And also looking at the man-made spaces again, but as they manifest in this capacity. This was in, these are all photographed in Guadalajara and Mexico City. Yeah, so these are newer themes, newer ideas that I'm working through. And again, still searching for something more, something expansive even in the restriction. In this case, in the background, it almost appears as this could be a white overcast sky, but it is indeed a wall in this building that I was at. And just this idea of playing with the understanding of what is literally present and what is beyond. And just moving through these spaces, viewing. Yeah, and here's some of the work as it exists. These are installation images from Pier 24 photography, where some of this work is on view and how the diptychs are operating in relation to some of the other photographs that I shared. And this idea of being in the literal outdoor urban environment, but also pulling it back to something a bit more intimate, the idea of interiority and a different kind of relationship with the same ideas and same platforms. Thank you.
Chanel, that was so wonderful to hear the arc of your practice and to hear you touch on the themes that you're working through right now. First, I just want to ask Scott, are there questions that I can pose right now, or
Yeah, let's go ahead and start with you.
okay. So one of the things that I just see time and again as you gave this presentation was nature juxtaposed with the human-made landscape, right? But there's something so hopeful in the way that I see nature in there. It's not like, one like leaf coming out of between two pavement. It's like it's so lush and it's growing, and it will grow more. And I was wondering if you could speak to that feeling that I imagine that you pick up on that too. There's some sort of inspiration. I can't put my finger on it, but
Yeah, I see it as a bit of an act of resistance, like not being confined to these built environments, like I said, that were meant to house working class people of color, Black people, and just keep them away. It wasn't meant to inspire any sort of access to upward mobility, but how these plants, to me, are reminiscent of the people that have transcended these spaces, that continue to transcend, and how that's a metaphor for it for me, but also just the beauty within these spaces. Again, these were places that were just overlooked, and it was largely due to the people that lived in these spaces, people that looked like me. And I just saw beauty in that, beauty in things I was taught. Well, this isn't, an English or French garden. Like, this is not proper. This isn't, but I saw it as beautiful. And I really loved that, something with that. But yeah, it's definitely a reoccurring theme. I think it's kind of translating differently as I move to more rural spaces and how that access, but I see them mirroring each other in different ways, which I find not coincidental in terms of migration and who's moving where, and just
but it's a beautiful thread
yes, yes,
that I see. And like it's like a wave. It gets it grows in some and decreases in others, and it's just like I'm really enjoying watching it through your work. And I love also the suggestion of nature that you bring with the shadows. There's always like tree shadows, and which also points to your amazing ability to layer your pictures. They're very complex, and yeah, you rarely have a vista, right? Like like there's the one where you have the Mississippi River.
Mhm.
That is like one of the few that I saw where you see far out. Mostly there's these man-made type of layers through, and some feel, I don't know if they feel constricting, because I don't know. Do you think some of them are constricting, or maybe like you build the space yourself? It's like
Yeah.
it's more like a construction. You're building your own studio outside in some ways.
Yeah, interesting enough, they don't feel constricting to me,
Yeah.
and that's really interesting that you point that out. It's always nice to have people see things that you may be doing subconsciously. But yeah, I try not to photograph them the way that they may actually feel in real life. It's quite the opposite. That's like my intervention into moving through those spaces.
Yeah. And the other thing that I just want to bring up is that when self-portraiture sometimes gives us like a false impression that you know the photographer, right? Or you know who the artist is. And but these are about you, but they're also not,
Yeah.
right? They're more about a collective kind of, and I'm wondering if you could just speak a little to that.
Yes. Thank you for that. So it's twofold where it is me tracking sometimes a very specific family history, but sometimes it's broader where it's like not every location is always directly related to my own ancestry. It's more diasporic in that sense. And I like to use myself as a bit of a conduit where it is me, but it's not exclusively about me. It's me as a stand-in for something larger than myself as I move through these spaces. And that is really important to me. And I definitely see the work expanding to kind of go beyond the States at some point, where it can touch many of these countries where the transatlantic slave trade had, anchor points at, to kind of bring it into more of a collective narrative that just goes beyond my start of my family history and just broader to tell something a bit more expansive. Um, but yes, yeah, definitely.
And Scott, how are we on time?
We're good. It's probably a great opportunity to shift to Vikesh and to welcome
Chanel.
him. Thank you both so much. That was really, really enriching. I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Vikesh Kapoor. Vikesh is an artist based in Los Angeles whose work examines race, class, and identity as a first-generation American. He has received numerous awards, including the Daylight Photo Award, the Joan Holt and Robervich Emerging Photographer Scholarship from the Houston Center for Photography, the Hopper Prize, the Photo NOLA Review Grand Prize, and a project development grant from Center in Santa Fe. Vikesh has been a finalist for the Documentary Essay Prize from the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University, the PH Museum Mobile Photography Prize, the Portrait Award from the Head On Photo Festival in Sydney, Australia, as well as a semi-finalist for the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery's Triennial competition. And we can add Medium Photo's Second Sight Award to that list. Vikesh is currently a fellow in the inaugural Google Image Equity Fellowship, which was produced in collaboration with For Freedoms, Aperture Foundation, Free the Work, and the Creative Theory Agency. Vikesh was nominated by the following reviewers in the 2022 Medium Review for the Second Sight Award. But please help me in welcoming Vikesh Kapoor.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to Chanell for that wonderful presentation. I had the pleasure of meeting Chanell for the first time at Medium Festival and was really taken by her work, so it's awesome to be in conversation with both her and Shana. together. So thank you very much. I am going to be sharing a brief overview of my ongoing project, See You at Home, and then speak a little bit about process, especially in relation to a conversation I had with Shana when we first met last year during lockdown via Zoom. So See You at Home is an ongoing personal narrative that centers on family, memory, and the myth and melancholy surrounding the American dream. My parents, Shailendra and Sarla Kapoor, immigrated from India in 1973 and settled in rural Pennsylvania in a small town of just 10,000 people. They're one of only few immigrant families in the region. And while they left India for a better life, the shift from a collectivist nation to an individualistic one led to isolation just as much as it led to freedom. As they continue to grow old in Pennsylvania with my sister and I no longer living there, their isolation only becomes more apparent to me. This project explores the dichotomy of home and homeland, freedom and isolation, collectivism and individualism through images I make of my parents' current life in America, imbued with memories of their past. Although this narrative began as a personal examination of diaspora, aging, and the South Asian experience, my ambition is that this project resonates with other first-generation Americans and all those seeking to find place and purpose here. I want this project to claim its singular place in the lexicon of what it means to be American, to be universal while honoring the nuance, intimacy, and singularity of the South Asian family story in America that is all too often untold. Thank you. I will share my screen now. So I will share about 10 photographs from the project, which, as I mentioned, is ongoing. This is an archival photograph of the ranch house that my parents moved into and currently live in, and where I lived in until I became an adult. As I started to explore my family album archive, I came across old slides like this photograph of them on their honeymoon in Europe. Before they immigrated to the States, they were living in the UK via India. And this was on their honeymoon through Europe. And although they looked pretty fabulous, they had an arranged marriage. They hardly knew each other at this point, apart from a few letters. They had met once in India and then had an arranged marriage. And my mother packed up and left her entire existence around her family and friends to live with this, at the time, stranger. So this is them on their honeymoon. When I started the project, it really was just a way to make memories with my parents, who I would only see twice a year. By the time I started this project, I was already living on the West Coast in Oregon, 3,000 miles away from them. And so it largely started out as just documentation. This photograph was on a 35mm camera and not staged. I made 2 frames. And so the photos were often made quickly in a moment that struck me, such as this. Same with this of my mother's hands. And this as well of my mother in the local mom and pop restaurant in our town. I suppose I made this photograph wanting to just commemorate this moment in which was the first time my mother actually ever went to this restaurant. Even after having lived in this town for 3 decades, this is one of the few independent restaurants in our town where a lot of families will go to after church, and I would often go to with my friends in high school, but she had never been. So this was the first and only time she went to Fox's restaurant. As the project progressed, I started to make still lifes around the home, take some liberties with moving things around, and this was kind of, this photograph, the bouquet, is an example of just moving a few things in the frame to better fit it, but really not setting up much more than that. So this was just, these were the items on my mother's mantle near her bed. On the left, far left there, we see a black and white photograph of them at their marriage and during their wedding. And the man in the middle with the white hat on is my mother's father, and he's handing a coconut to my parents, which symbolizes him handing his daughter over to my father. In the middle is a photograph of me in high school wearing a tie, even though I went to a public school, and maybe referencing some sense of ambition at the time. And curiously, on the far right there was a photograph, a stock photograph of a woman in a blonde bride with blue eyes, and my mom had, for whatever reason, still had not taken it out of the frame, and it was sitting on that pedestal. This is a photograph called Holy Fountain. As I've continued the project, we had photographs like the bouquet, which were on medium format film and higher fidelity, and then there were photographs like this, which were just on point shoots. This is a photograph I made in 2014 when they came to visit me out west, but the photo is like pretty grainy and has some color casts and could read as a photograph made in the mid-90s or something. And I like that confusion that happens between the past and present and memory and current time. This is a photograph in the family room, and you'll notice on the blanket there, if you look closely, there's a Playboy logo on the blanket. This photograph is called My Father's Den. I initially, when I wanted to make this photograph, I was thinking a lot about how the idea of like American consumption and the amount of stuff a lot of us have. And this is a large reason why my parents are stuck in this house and can't move out and enjoy the last chapter of their life closer to me, or in a greater community. They have lived in this house for so long and gathered and collected so many things, and they also worked very late into their lives. They're my father's actually 90 years old, the age of Chanel's grandmother, and so they're quite old and kind of can't really mobilize, and so this final chapter of their life is in a way stuck inside of this home. And so initially I made this photograph just to show the stuff, and the American flag happened to be draped like that. This photograph exhibited as part of a group show at Silver Eye Center for Photography in Pittsburgh, and the director at the time, David Orsick, had asked community members for community perspectives to be included with the wall text. And I really liked this idea, and the person who contributed to my wall text was a undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon who actually launched this thing called the Silver List. And he was really taken by my work because he too is Asian but Chinese, and he wrote beautifully about this photograph and how he felt that he could locate himself and his family within the items populated in the photograph. And he argued that the American flag is actually not the focal point. And I really liked that idea of he being able to locate himself within such a personal photograph to my life. So this is the last photograph I'm going to share from the project. I'm going to shift over now to talk a little bit about process, which led to an installation for one of my first solo exhibitions earlier this year. A lot of my work as an artist is influenced by folk art, folk music, folk painters, vernacular art. And when I was in New Orleans one year, I went to the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and I was introduced to a pretty well-known folk painter who was born on a plantation farm in Louisiana and also died in Louisiana, named Clementine Hunter. And this painting specifically is up at the Ogden. It's a part of their collection. And I was initially struck by the shape of the painting. You know, I've seen panoramic landscape oil paintings in museums, but I'd never seen them vertically like this. And so that really caught my eye. And once I started to look at the painting, I loved the narrative that was illustrated here, based on how the river cuts in and out of the frame. And we see these Black families and these Black communities and how they interact with the river and how they live along the river. You know, we see a baptism, we see churchgoers at the top, and we see a baptism. We see people living near the river and washing their clothes, harvesting, going to church, and then gravestones at the bottom right, which I just thought was so brilliant. It kind of reminded me of the Klimt painting, I'm forgetting the name right now, where it goes from left to right, showing a baby and a grandmother. And just the narrative that was achieved in this painting, while also using an anchor point like the river, was just something I had never seen before in a painting, and it really struck me. At the same time, I was asked to write for the first time about a photograph of mine for the National Portrait Gallery Smithsonian, and this was the photograph that was up for this competition to be exhibited, and I wrote about the memories around this pool. I'll read this. My father had just finished raking the leaves out when I made this portrait of him in the childhood swimming pool. He still tends to it even though it's no longer used. Here it lives in a continuous state of decay. This pool is where he taught me how to swim when I was 1.5 years old. This is the pool where so many home videos were made. Him chasing me around the pool with the hose, eating lunch with aunties that were visiting from India and from times even before I was born. This is the state of the pool now and has been for years. I made this portrait after not seeing him for 8 months. I try to visit as often as I can. When I made this photograph, I was not really thinking about how strange it was that not only was my father wearing this outfit in there, but he was raking the leaves out for a pool that hadn't been used for many years. And I realized that so many of our memories, home memories, family memories have occurred around this pool. It being a ranch house, we didn't have a basement or anything like that to entertain people. So often any kind of entertaining would happen in the summer months in the backyard around this pool. And so it really felt tender to me that maybe my father, you know, felt sentimental about this space, even though it had aged and is decaying. So as I was thinking about this, I was in my first artist residency in Woodstock, New York, at the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and I spent the majority of my time there going through old family photographs in the family album archive, and I came across this photograph, which was really exciting to me because not only was it just my dad in the swimming pool hanging out, but it was him on a blue and red raft that were very similar in color to the robe and hat he was wearing. And I just loved the serendipity of and discovery of this. And so that led me to collecting other photographs around the pool, which there were many because, you know, like many families, you're making memories during certain occasions, like summertime, like this, or you know, memories. These are memories around the pool, my mother here, or some of those memories I wrote about, like Indian aunties wearing saris, flipping burgers, which I thought was pretty fantastic, or Indian families visiting us from New Jersey and New York during summer months. This didn't happen once I was coming of age. We didn't really have visitors as much, and I saw that isolation kind of set in for my parents. I collected also photographs of just my family and water, you know, not necessarily around the pool. This led me to then, you know, again, thinking about the Clementine Hunter painting and experimenting with layouts and how those old photographs could be in dialogue with the photograph I made of my father. And so at my next artist residency, which was last year in Chicago at a place called Latitude, I started kind of just experimenting with laying them out, and maybe, you know, experimenting with laying photographs that are in the pool, having them touch the photograph, and photographs that are made in the yard, like lay them further away from the pool, but creating this kind of like topographic version. And around this time, shortly after this time, I had my first conversation with Shana. We had just been introduced through Senya Norell, who was a curator at the Print Center, and Shana had just started talking to me about an exhibition she was working on called Sightlines, which is up right now at SF MoMA, and Chanell is a part of, and I had the privilege of getting to see recently. And Shana was talking about this idea of sightlines, and I think we had the term satellites had come up, and I was thinking about these photographs as satellites to the contemporary image. And it's kind of an amalgamation of our talk and discovery of this archive and the Clementine Hunter painting, which inspired me to create an installation for my first solo exhibition, which coincidentally was at the Print Center, where Senya Norell was the curator, and I got to work with Senya on this installation. And it was my first kind of go at creating this topography, and so I worked with Senya, and I gave her free rein to lay out the archival images. So here we see the contemporary photograph that I made of my father framed, and then we used photo text for the archival photographs. And I knew that I wanted to also explore home videos. And again, a lot of the home videos that were made were often made in the summer months around the pool. So there are many of them of me and my father, of my father swimming. So this was the first time I actually inserted myself into the work, apart from just being behind the lens. There's a photograph on the wall of me in a inner tube, and there are videos of me as well playing with my father in the pool. And so it was exciting to start integrating other media and creating more of an experience for the viewer. here's a little video just of the space. And you might be able to hear the audio a little bit, but we had the audio playing quietly in the space. And so the videos were on loop for about an hour, but each of the videos were at different lengths. So inadvertently, what happened with the audio was the audio would overlap from each video in a different way every time it played. And so that to me evoked this idea of fragmented memory and how things are ever shifting. And it was cool to have that audio, the subliminal audio happening as viewers went around the exhibition. There were other walls that just had more traditional hangings of photographs. And so you would hear this in the background subliminally, and it would forever be changing. And so that was pretty exciting to me, and is kind of a step in where I want to go in terms of creating more of an experience for the viewer in the exhibition space with audio and video, potentially sculpture, and not just have it be photographs on the wall. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share. I just wanted to share a brief overview of the project and a little bit about process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikesh. Thank you for, I had no idea that our conversation spurred this beautiful installation. And I believe that we were talking about actually a different show, Constellations, because where we had anchors, where we had contemporary acquisitions or that we put in dialogue with historical photographs, and thinking about the nonlinear kind of way that the mind works when you make connections, right? It can be a formal connection, a conceptual or intellectual connection. It can be just place. There were lots of different things. And what your installation tells me, or just what it evokes for me, is memory, because you are playing also with scale, right? So you have, like with memory, some moments are so much stronger and bigger and have so much more presence. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about like what that experience was, kind of creating that, like, and Senya getting free reign over the smaller memories. Like, how did that feel to have someone doing that?
I thank you very much. Yeah, I was excited to work with Senya. She's just she's so smart, and just I was excited to see what she could bring to the exhibition. Again, it was one of my first solo exhibitions, so I'm still learning. And one idea she had was to project the videos a little bit lower. In the original mock-up I gave her, it was a lot more, everything was kind of in the middle of the wall, and she suggested putting the videos a little bit lower so people would have to bend down and look at them as if they were a child, and they were short. And so I thought that was interesting. And in terms of the scale of the archival photographs, it was actually the first time I treated them that way. Often in other group exhibitions and when I've spoken about the work, I like the slippage of time and creating a blur of past and present. And so one way I do that is by creating confusion of scale between the contemporary and the archive. And so sometimes in exhibitions, I'll create a photo text of an archival images that's actually larger than the contemporary image, and the contemporary image is over top of it. And I do that as a way to, for two reasons. One is that, like, instead of, for one reason in scale is to let the archival images envelope the contemporary images, and just as memories often, surround us, loom larger than life sometimes, haunt us. And so that's one approach. And then the other reason is because what is the other reason? It's my train of thought.
It's like the story of my life when I give presentations.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, it'll come back to me. But this was the first time where I treated the archival images small, as they would maybe be printed back then, and creating an intimacy where the viewer has to go up close to look at them, you know.
It's really successful.
Thank you.
And it also prompts me to ask you about the role of photography in your life before you decided to venture on down this road. When you use images that are part of your family kind of history, it makes me wonder, like, did you go through the family album together? Or were there just always pictures up on the walls behind you? Did they have a Polaroid around? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing is my father was always taking pictures, and yeah, our family room, and actually every room was littered with photographs. In the photograph I shared of my dad on the couch with the hot pink Playboy blanket, like in the background, you can see there are all these, just like the wall is covered in photographs, and we have those old style frames that have many photographs in one frame, circle images and oval images and rectangular and square. And so in a sense, he was creating like a personal family, an exhibition in the home. And so that must have had some effect on me without me even knowing it. And then really, I didn't get interested in making my own photographs until my mother gave me a camera. It was just like a plastic Minolta 35mm SLR that was automatic and very easy to just make photographs that looked nice without knowing anything about the technical aspects of making a photograph. And I took that camera on my first trip to India when I was coming of age. I hadn't been to India since I was 5 years old. And then I suddenly went 16 years later when I was 21 with my father, and I went back and revisited all of these places from his childhood. And that was a really impactful trip. And actually, initially in See You at Home, I had integrated photographs from India, which I'm actually planning to do again. And so when I received the first grants for the project, one award, which was actually awarded by Corey Keller, who was at SF MoMA, I had photographs from India in the project from those trips. And so some of the earliest photographs I made for this project are from when I was 21. And so that was really important in a sense, to make those photographs, not only to create those memories with family who I hadn't seen in so many years, and who I didn't know when I would see them again, but also in places that were important to my dad, like his childhood home, and which have now since been demolished. And so to have photographs of him older sitting on the roof of his childhood home is just great. I love that I have that. And so it really just came from a place of memory making. I wasn't really thinking about photographs as an artist. And I'm a songwriter as well. And at the time,
I'm glad you're going to bring this up.
Yeah. And so I had some nerve damage occur from playing my instruments, and so I picked up the camera as a way to express myself, because I didn't know if I would be able to play guitar again. And so I was trying to think of other ways to tell stories in different mediums. And so that's kind of the camera became a vehicle for that.
And how are we on time? Sorry, Scott.
We're fine. We can wrap it up in another few minutes.
Okay. I would just love to hear Vikesh talk about music versus like an oral component, because it's interesting that you had an audio component to that installation, and just thinking about your background in music, which I learned all about last night. Please
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, I for the longest time was keeping them separate, and then I realized it's okay to be a multidisciplinary artist that just uses different mediums for different narratives or different things one wants to express. And as a musician, I really started out as a folk musician, and I was telling narratives about my town and the people in my town, and people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, characters in the American tapestry who were really important to creating historical documents of America. They were really influential to me early on, and these topical elements, these protest songs, the civil rights movement, the folk revival of the 60s, these were all really impactful on me. For whatever reason, it may have been because I felt like my family were underdogs in our town. It may have been because I grew up in a lower middle class town where people were struggling. And so a lot of my friends' families, I saw firsthand what would happen. And so the idea of like folk art and speaking about one's community felt very natural to me. And so I feel that like I'm, in a sense, just a folk artist working in different mediums. And so the vernacular is really important to me. Self-taught artists are important to me, and access is also really important to me, and how people can access my work and dialogue with it. You know, what's interesting is like the philanthropy for the arts within the South Asian community is very little, and there is actually very little representation for South Asian American art in America. And so I know what I'm doing is kind of at the forefront of that right now, but it's not really connecting yet to the South Asian communities, because a lot of those communities don't really exist within the art world. So I'm currently thinking about how do I engage with those communities who will directly be influenced or affected by my work. And so, you know, trying to find ways to social practice or community engagement, you know, working with universities, I think are steps forward in doing that outside of just like the fine art world.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, and you know, I want to thank everybody today. You know, one of the things that is so nice about these conversations is the unexpected intersections that emerge, and I love this sense of the overlapping of time that's seen in both of your work. The physicality of overlapping is also a really interesting connection that I didn't expect. That it's just been really a nice delight. I do want to thank each of you, all of our guests, the three of you, for the conversation today, and to everybody who was able to join this live talk. We have our next Second Sight conversation occurs on Thursday, October 27th. That's with Lindy Lettinen, Amir Sadiq, and Gabriela Suarez. I hope that many of you will be able to join us for that. And then a final reminder that the 2023 Medium Review opens for its registration process on November 15th. That's mid-November. Our festival in the new year will include community participation across the Kumeyaay lands of Tijuana and San Diego from April 1st to 16th in the new year. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night wherever you're joining us from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.